back to the history of Christianity. In today's lesson, we're now going to break into the second section of our course for the semester, and we are going to look at medieval Christianity. We finished up the patristic period, and now we're moving into the medieval times. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the rise of the papacy. So stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay, class, we're going to move into the PowerPoint portion of our lecture on the papacy. End of an era. In 410 AD, Rome is captured by the invading barbarians. As the Roman Empire expanded out and the emperors were able to shore up their defenses against the invading hordes on the edges of the empire, over time, the emperors did have to kind of pull back and deal with internal issues and all of that, and so the military had to pull back, and the barbarians were able to make some really significant inroads into the empire until in 410 AD, Rome is actually captured. The Western Empire is crumbling. The eastern portion of the empire, we can't forget there's the eastern portion and the western portion. We definitely are focusing on the west, but the eastern portion remains, and the church is there, and it actually develops separate from the west. But the barbarians are coming across what we would say is what we would call Europe, and just invading the Roman Empire. The empire is pretty much gone, but the church would remain. And the empire would actually become the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne in about 4 centuries. It's going to turn into the Holy Roman Empire when Charlemagne is crowned by the Pope. And that empire, the Holy Roman Empire, is going to last until Napoleon, which is the late 18th century when Napoleon begins to make his move. But a new challenge has to be met by the church, and that is to evangelize and teach the Christian faith to all of these pagans coming into the empire. Here's a map of the invasions, and you can just see the different groups that are coming in. You have the Goths, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, the Vandals. So you just see the different groups that are coming into Europe and just crushing the empire. Over here you see Angles and Saxons. They come across and they take Britain, and then you can see here the Eastern Roman Empire over on this side. Okay, the Barbarian Kingdoms. The broken Roman Empire solidified into smaller kingdoms. The Vandals came in and they conquered West-North Africa, but they were destroyed by the Muslims in the 8th century. The Visigoths came in, they conquered Spain and southern Gaul, which is France, and they were destroyed by the Muslims in the 8th century. The Burgundians conquered Middle Gaul, which is France. The Franks conquered northern Gaul, France, and then the Burgundians to unify most of Gaul. And so when we think of this is going to be where you hear of Charles the Hammer Martel, and then Charlemagne, which that's when the Roman Empire, which is crumbled, becomes the Holy Roman Empire. There's the Angles and Saxons, which conquer Great Britain, and during this time is when you begin to see St. Patrick in Ireland doing what he was doing there with monasteries and spreading of the church, and then Columba as he crossed over from Ireland into Britain itself, and he evangelized the barbarians in Britain. And that's a really interesting story if you ever want to do some research on Columba and his monastery at Iona, and how basically he evangelized the barbarians and set up the church in Britain, separate from what was going on in Rome. So that's a really interesting story if you ever wanted to look into that. The Ostrogoths conquered Italy. The Lombards conquered northern Italy. So you just see the barbarian groups that are coming in and conquering different parts of Europe. Western monasticism and the Benedictine monks. So the Benedictine monks, this is, as you see there down on the last part of the bullet point there, the 480 AD, Benedict, he's the one that began the Benedictine monks. This monastic order tended to be very practical and very missional. They did not focus on isolation, which you would think about with the Desert Fathers, but they focused on community or establishing communes. And also, they were brought under the authority of the church. So you had this hierarchy that would go all the way up in the church, but it was from the monastery, would go up into the hierarchy of the church. In 480 A.D., Benedict is born under Ostrogoth rule. He became a monk and isolated himself, but he did gain a following, and then he built a monastery at Monte Cassino, Italy. This is a very famous monastery, and as you look at history and you think of World War II, in the Second World War, the German army occupied Monte Cassino in Italy. The monastery was still there, and they were able to use it as a place to be able to see the American movements in Italy because it sits really high up on a mountain. And the United States bombed that monastery into oblivion, and the monastery was completely destroyed in the 1940s. So the monastery lasted a very long time there at Monte Cassino, Italy. Benedict wrote what is called the Rule, R-U-L-E, which dictated the daily lives of monks in monasteries, and that really became the textbook for monastic orders. It shaped monasticism for centuries. And some of the rules they had there, you see the bullet point list there on the screen. Monks could not leave for another monastery. Monks were to give complete obedience to the abbot, which means father, or the leader of the monastery. Physical labor was mandatory. The core of life was prayer, which they prayed 8 times a day, and one of those prayer times had to be in the middle of the night. And they spent their time in prayer and meditation, all that, but they also copied books and copied the scriptures. So that's where you begin getting scribes in monasteries, and they became very artistic and very beautiful. Later on, monasteries will put out illuminated scriptures, which is very highly decorated pages of the scriptures. That's where you see like the first letter of the page is really big, and there's like flowers and vines and different designs coming off of it. Very, very ornate illumination of the scripture is what it's called. The Papacy adopted the rule for monasticism in Western Europe. Okay, so now we're going to look at the Papacy. In the early church, Pope, it means father, and it was used in earlier times just for the bishops. They were just called father. Scholars believe that after Peter was killed, there was a collective body of bishops in Rome. The Eastern and North African church had much more activity and authority than Rome until Constantine, until he made it a Christian empire. So a lot of the formulation of the early church actually took place in North Africa. So the early church, they had bishops. They called them father. But what happened was the Bishop of Rome came to prominence, and that was because of the fall of the Roman Empire at the hands of the barbarians. And so if the civil authorities are crumbling and the emperors are crumbling because of these invading hordes, and they're setting up their own little kingdoms, what always remained steady was the Pope's authority. The influx of these barbarians brought an influx of the Pope's authority because the church was always looked at as separate from the civil authority, even though at times it looked like it was intermingled, or the civil authority was over the church, or the church was over the civil authority. During the fall of the Roman Empire, the Pope's authority would remain. And basically, the title of Pope came to mean the title for the Bishop of Rome. So if you think of Pope, you think of Rome. And he was basically the one that was the unifier of Christianity in this shattered land. Okay, so let's look at some popes here. Pope Leo I, he was born around 400 and he lived to 461 AD. He's considered the first modern pope. He's actually the 45th pope from Peter, if you went back that far in the line. But he's considered the first modern pope, Pope Leo I. He's also known as Leo the Great. He became very powerful after confronting Attila the Hun, who was trying to invade the Italian peninsula. Just that confrontation of this barbarian who was very successful in his exploits Leo I became well known and became powerful. He also confronted the Vandals who were invading Rome, and he actually saved the city from being burned by the Vandals. So he rises to prominence. He was convinced that Jesus made all of Peter's successors the rock on which Jesus would build his church. Therefore, the Pope was the head of the church. Okay, so throughout papal history, there's all kinds of problems, and it begins early on. And we're going to talk about all kinds of problems coming up here in the medieval church. But for right now, 498 A.D., we see this issue with two popes at one time, and this is interesting because the Pope is supposed to be the head of the church. So how can the church have two heads? But also the Pope is supposed to be the mediator or the vicar of Christ on earth. So how can there be two mediators to God? So that was the church's belief, and especially the firm belief as the medieval times continue, and the popes really consolidate their power. But in 498, the Ostrogoths had invaded and supported a Roman bishop to be pope. The Eastern Church put forward their own pope in Constantinople. So we have one pope being put forward in Rome and one in Constantinople. And we see their names there. Symmachus was the Western Pope, 498 to 514, and Lawrence was the Eastern Pope. And they served simultaneously for 7 years until Lawrence died. And the supporters of the popes ended up fighting each other, and several synods were needed to resolve the issue. And again, the important thing here is that the church is going to really begin to have this infighting over who is going to be pope. And sometimes it even came to armed conflict. But we see the church fighting within itself who is going to be its head, and where is the head going to be, in Rome or in Constantinople? Okay, the next guy we're going to talk about here is Pope Pelagius II, 520 to 590 AD. And we're obviously not going to talk about every single pope. And we're going to see the timeline continue to move through here, 520 to 590 AD, so we're in the 6th century now. Pope Benedict I died in 579 as the Lombards threatened Rome from the north. Pelagius II saved Rome by buying off the Lombards. So now we have a pope paying off an invading barbarian group to save the city. He tried for help from Constantinople. He asked, hey, church over there, we're the same church, even though we're divided here geographically, and we are kind of going our separate way, we are still Christians, so can you come help with this barbarian group? But little help came from Constantinople. So what did the Pope do? He turned to the west. He turned to the Franks, who, again, were another barbarian group. And the Franks are in France, and he turned to them to attack the Lombards. Now, although they did not attack the Lombards, the Franks did not, it is important to know that the Pope looked to, first off, another barbarian group, but second, to the west. He looked to the west for help. In the end, the Lombards did invade, and they did take Rome in the end. But the important point is that the Pope tried to get help from somebody else, a barbarian group that was in the west. Okay, next is Gregory I, or Gregory the Great, born around 540 A.D. and lived till 604. Now at his death, we've now moved into the 7th century. Gregory I, or Gregory the Great, not much is known of his early years before becoming a monk. In 586 AD, Pope Pelagius II made Gregory abbot of a monastery in Rome. An epidemic broke out in Rome, and the church cared for the people, giving them food, clothing to the sick. They buried the dead. And Pelagius II became sick and died. Okay, so the Pope got sick and died. He did not really want, Gregory I did not really want to become Pope, but the clergy and the people elected him anyway. Once elected, he began this papal responsibility with zeal. He really set out to do a good job. He organized food and wheat shipments for the city, for the people. He rebuilt the aqueducts in the city that were destroyed by war. He helped rebuild Rome's defenses and garrison forces. The garrison is like the army that's in the city. He secured the peace with the Lombards. So, in essence, he really became the leader of Rome. The Pope was like the civil leader and the ecclesiastical leader because he was setting out to really help out the people of Rome and bolster the city. So Gregory I, continuing with him, as leader of the church, he was committed to preaching. He promoted clerical celibacy, so the priests could not get married. He spread the gospel to the pagan groups in these conquered areas, and he was an abundant writer. I'm sorry about that typo there. I saw a couple other typos on the screen previously. As a theologian, he based his beliefs on Augustine's belief of a purification place for the dead soul before going to heaven. And so Gregory kind of promoted the doctrine of purgatory. He delved into the doctrine of penance, or how one can satisfy God for their sins. And he said, Gregory said there had to be contrition, there had to be confession, there had to be physical punishment, and there had to be absolution. So those are the four areas for doing penance. A lot of times we think of penance being some kind of physical thing, physical penance. But there are four things to it: contrition, confession, physical punishment, and absolution. As theologian, just continuing with this thought, the living can help the dead get out of purgatory by offering masses for the dead. The Mass was viewed as an actual physical sacrifice of Christ each time it was offered. Now, this belief would continue all through the Middle Ages, all the way up until the Reformation. Gregory stated that a monk had died in sin and went to purgatory. After a Mass was offered for the dead monk, 30 days later his spirit appeared to another monk and stated that he had been released from purgatory and moved on into heaven. So when you have the Pope putting forth this story, of course people are going to be offering Masses for their dead relative. And when I say offering Masses, they go to the Mass with the hope of springing their relative early from purgatory. Under Gregory's superstition, which at one time had been held at bay, superstition and just these odd thoughts were kind of held off. But under Gregory, superstition really did start to encroach the church, and people started doing different things to gain merit or to help them ward off evil. So it just really started to spring up, and that's going to become all throughout the medieval times. The superstition really increases within the church. Okay, before we finish up this PowerPoint, we do need to look at the Arab conquest. In the 7th century, Muhammad took control of Arabia. In 622 AD, he took refuge in Medina, and his flight began the Muslim era. Through military and political campaigns, he took Mecca and controlled most of Arabia. And there's a 14th century painting of subjects submitting to Muhammad. So we're not going to go into great detail of Muhammad's life, but we do need to talk about the Arab conquest because of the Crusades, which we'll be talking about coming up. Continuing with the Arab conquest, after his death, the caliphs, they are known as the successors, they continued their conquering. Abu Bakr consolidated Islamic power. Omar invaded Syria. And then you just see the domino effect of the Muslim incursion. 635, Damascus fell. 638, Jerusalem. 642, Egypt. 647, the northern coast of Africa. 651, Persia. 695, Carthage. In 711 AD, Muslims crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and invaded Iberia, which is in Spain. So what they did was they came across the entire northern portion of Africa, crossed over the little Strait of Gibraltar, and then went into Spain. And then finally in 732, Charles the Hammer Martel, which is Charlemagne's grandfather, stopped the Muslims at the Battle of Tours in France. Many Christian lands and holy sites were now in Muslim hands. The Byzantines were pushed into Turkey, and Christianity really just began to focus on the West, which was Italy, France, and Britain, really focused there until the Crusades, when they decided to return to the Holy Land to try to free the Holy Land of the Muslims. And that's it for this PowerPoint. I'll see you in a second. All right, class, that's it for today. Next time, we're going to be looking at the Eastern Church. We can't forget that there is an Eastern side of the church that is going on, and that's going to last for quite some time. But we're going to look at Eastern Christianity next time, and we're mainly going to look at some doctrinal issues that arise and how the church settled those doctrinal issues. So stay tuned for that. Keep up on the reading. See you next time.